and welcome to Phil-Sci-Theo, a discussion series in the intersect of philosophy of science and theology. In this series, we'll be focusing on topics on time and memory. My name is Buki Fatona. I'm a researcher here at the University of Oxford in philosophy of science and religion. Some of our interviewees will also be from the University of Oxford, whilst others will be from further afield. Enjoy. Hello and welcome to the new series of Phil-Sci-Theo. In this season, we're looking at memory and time. And I'm very excited because our very first guest is Professor Meghan Page, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Loyola University Maryland. And she received her PhD from the University of Pittsburgh. Her research in philosophy of science centers on paleoclimatology, particularly questions about indirect evidence, the construction of historical narratives and models of the past. Whilst her work in philosophy of religion uses scientific conceptual frameworks to elucidate, extend, or challenge prevailing philosophical models of concepts like faith and divine creativity. Today, Professor Page and I will be talking about modeling the past. You're very welcome to Phil-Sci-Theo.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's very good to be with you.
Well, I'm going to get started and go first to the first question. I was fortunate enough to be one of the participants in a research project on which you are the principal investigator. It's entitled, as you know, Building Foundations in Science Engaged Theology, Insights from Philosophy of Science. The course was a pivotal point for me. I became more systematic in my engagement with philosophy of science, and indeed it inspired this series, Phil-Sci-Theo. So obviously I have answers to this first question, but I think you will handle it with greater expertise. It is this: what is science-engaged theology, and how is it enriched by philosophy of science?
Yes. Okay. I think that's a great question. I definitely want to sort of put a little footnote here and say, I'm going to answer what I think of as science-engaged theology, or sort of my own understanding of how one might approach that topic. I think there's like different views on this. It became like a big thing, people sort of arguing and disagreeing over what is science-engaged theology. But I'm just going to set all of that to the side and give my own answer. When I think of science-engaged theology, I think of people looking at science, scientific findings, the practice of science through a theological lens. Or I think, I think of asking theological questions and being really expansive in our sense of what counts as resource material for answering them, and including the sciences into that sense of our broader sense of resources and resource material for theology. I think for me, both science and theology operate in my own categorical system as methods of knowledge production. So I think when you're doing theology, you're engaged in a kind of knowledge production, trying to, in the language and categories of our time, for the people of our time and culture, understand and interpret answers to certain questions by drawing on some set of sources. And I think the process of science is very similarly a kind of knowledge construction where we collectively ask as, so in like social groups of humans, we're collectively asking these questions and trying to find answers that we can share to them in languages and conceptual structures we can share. So for me, science-engaged theology is really bringing those two methods of knowledge production into a kind of dialogue, into a shared project of working together and creating this bigger sense of knowledge production where we're less siloed and less, isolated to whatever resources we're used to working with and answering narrower topics in our field.
Thank you. That was very helpful. It was a very rich answer. So how does philosophy of science help with it?
Yeah, how does philosophy of science help with this? So, I think philosophy of science helps because it gives perspective on what the process of science is like. I think philosophy of science helps because it has looked at science as a method of knowledge production. And I think that sometimes gives lenses and paradigms to theology to be sort of self-reflective. So if we think, oh, science is a kind of knowledge production and we're doing something similar in theology, I think it helps give us both a foil to say, like, well, how is theology different? What are the knowledge producing norms here? How does this system work? There's certain like features of knowledge production, like inference and evidence, that have been studied a lot by philosophers of science when thinking about science. And I just don't think we haven't asked those questions in the same way or looked with the same level of scrutiny at some of the productive methods in theology. And so I think looking at work that's been done in science can not like give us, a way of asking the question, a jumping off point, a kind of foil, an understanding of what's similar and what's different. So I think philosophy of science is helpful there. I also think for some people doing science engaged theology involves like using science as a foundation to build your theology. And I think that's a way of approaching the world as well. And if that is the way one chooses to engage, I think their philosophy of science is really helpful in giving you a lens to understand how science is related to the world. Um, and so I think that some people who, like when I was working more explicitly in the field of science engaged theology or working with researchers who were engaged in that field, I think a lot of people felt frustrated because they sort of were like, well, I don't know what science says. And, as a philosopher of science, you're like, of course, that's what's great about it. But so I think that their philosophy of science can be helpful because it gives you a framework for even knowing what questions to ask about the research you're engaging with.
Thank you very much for that. Another question popped into my mind, and I worry that it takes us a little bit off tangent, but I can't resist asking it. And you keep using the phrase knowledge production. Are you making a metaphysical claim on the nature of knowledge? Do we generate knowledge or do we discover knowledge? And is there a difference?
I think I am. In a sense, it's a metaphysical claim. I think, if anything, I'm displaying a kind of academic heritage. I think that in a lot of the more constructive, like philosophy of science circles that I work in, people speak of knowledge production, like stuff in the sociology of science. We think about science as knowledge production. I don't know. But I never know how heavily metaphysical this question really is. Um, because I don't think that to call science knowledge production is necessarily to say there's no discovery involved. But I think that it's to remember and to always keep present the human element of science as a field, as, something that we do have to think up and put into language, rather than some kind of like direct connection to the thing. And I think that is a metaphysical claim, right? So I think that there's a sense we're talking about knowledge production is metaphysical. I don't think it has to be as robustly metaphysical as the claim is sometimes interpreted. For me, I use it and it's helpful as a way of remembering and keeping focused that we are involved in like a very human process when we're doing science and when we're doing theology, and sort of keeping that present in our conversation rather than ignoring it or pressing it to the side.
Thank you. I think we'll maybe return to it when we talk more specifically about modeling the past, because I think it does connect to what extent those constructs that you put forward, to what extent are they generated, or to what extent are they discoveries?
Mm.
The second question is, one of your areas of research is history and philosophy of science. How do you see the relation between these fields of knowledge, so history on the one hand and philosophy of science on the other?
Hmm. Yes. So I think, again, in some sense, this points to a kind of academic heritage and kind of a story in the history and philosophy of science, which is, people think of contemporary philosophy of science as being really I mean, people have been doing philosophy of science as long as people have been doing philosophy. But I think there's a certain heritage of philosophy of science that we think of as beginning with positivism and like the positivism of the early 20th century. And there were a lot of attempts there to understand science essentially, meaning like decontextualized. And this idea that we could think of scientific knowledge was context independent. It was a way of knowing and relating to the world that was purely about formal methods, that it would be the key to developing a sort of context independent language with which we could describe reality. And well, the very famous instance of this is Kuhn, but he was not the only one to make the point, was like, well, but if we look at the history of science, it doesn't work like that at all, right? It seems like if we want to really understand science and this method of inquiry and this method of inference in any kind of deep way, and in any kind of way where it really locks into and maps onto the world as we experience it, these idealizations don't seem to fit. And that's where history became an important part of the study of science, because we can't just look at some scientific textbook to understand science. We think of science as situated in an ongoing intellectual dialogue and in the, ongoing, I would say, construction of culture. So, so I think of history and philosophy of science. In some ways, I think of the philosophy of science as always an attempt to understand the more essential, so we would say, properties of science, or look at the methodology, things like that. And history always reminds us to look at the context, the sociology, the trajectory over time. And I think a complete understanding always involves, well, I don't think we ever have a complete understanding, but I think what we strive for and should strive for is to hold those two things constantly in dialogue. Um, that we can, I do think looking at methodology and inference structures is really interesting and important and brings us a kind of understanding. I think if we completely detach those from the situation in which they're embedded, and from the species in which they're embedded, which is us, I think we have a tendency to create knowledge that it can be really harmful and actually lead us astray. So yeah, I think of history and philosophy of science as looking at science both in terms of what it is, but also in terms of its story, its narrative story.
Can the tools of the study of history and philosophy of science, so some of the ones you've raised now about examining culture and the people and the society, so can those tools be applied to and be used to critique Christian narratives? And I gave two examples of the
Yeah.
creation story and the incarnation.
I think this is a really interesting question, and I think my answer to it is going to turn on what we mean by critique. So I think there's a sense where we might, by critique, if we mean judge, I am hesitant to say yes. Like, can we use science to judge these narratives of theology? I'm inclined to say no. That would be an inappropriate way of relating the methods of knowledge production. But critique, I don't think reduces to judgment. So, and this goes back to what I like about the framing of the language of science engaged theology. So I think if what we mean is, can we bring them into dialogue, and should that dialogue be capable of creating real change, then yes, right? So I guess you might think it's the difference between getting referee comments and getting paper acceptance or denial. So I'm not sure that I think science can tell us if we should accept or deny the paper, full stop. But I do think that it can give us comments on it. Um, and where we go with that is sort of its own kind of question. So yes, critique in terms of dialogue, in terms of mutual conceptual change, in terms of bringing these stories together, of holding them as having a kind of unity and being about the same world. Um, no, if what we mean is one becomes like a tribunal for the other. I'm hesitant to go in that direction.
Thank you. That's helpful. I guess what I was trying to get at, and I think judge is, in that sense, a good word, is the way Christians read scripture. Well, some Christians is not to take certain narratives as actual or literal,
Mhm.
and to take some as factual and that they occurred in history. So I was thinking, could you use those tools from your research and help to better judge how to determine which narrative is factual and historical and which one isn't?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Like I'm trying to think about it in terms of how would we phrase it as a falsifiable question or something like that to go back to Popper. So in terms of, gosh, something like the creation narrative. And this is where it's hard because I do think it depends on what do people take to be the creation narrative. So if they think that those are like literal times and literal years, then I do think the timelines posed by geohistory like then it challenges those narratives. But I don't even think of those as necessarily being the Christian narrative. I think of it as being an interpretation of the Christian narrative. So that's where I think it's a little bit tricky and why I say I'm hesitant for judgment. I'm more open to some kind of critical dialogue. Uh, with something like the incarnation, I don't even know. I mean, even if we were living now with Jesus, I don't know how we would test to see if he was God in a scientific way. Like, I don't really know what that means. It's hard for me to like think about that in terms of like a scientific question. I just don't know. So, I mean, I wouldn't say that you can't. I would say that I'm not the person to ask. Don't put me in charge of that project because I don't have any good ideas. Um, yes, that's kind of my response.
It's a good response because it kind of tells us the limits of science engaged theology, I guess, to an
Yeah.
extent. There are certain areas where it's just impossible to apply one to the other fully to
Yeah,
make
yes. Like
certain
again,
kinds
as
of
a judgment.
judgments. Yes.
Judgment. So I think that if you were trying to determine, and again, too, it's like, what are our theological questions and how are we asking them? But I think having scientific knowledge about humanity or human nature or what people are like might give you a richer picture of Jesus or affect your story of Jesus in some way. Which is why I want to say that there can be critique, because I think that that's a like that kind of critical engagement, anything that's going to press back on or, affect the way that we classify and understand the world, I think of as critical in a way that's positive. And so I do think we can have that kind of critical engagement, but I don't think we can get science to answer our binary questions about theology or something like that. It doesn't, at least I can't, right? My mind is not quite able to think of it in that way.